Okay, let's look at Standard 22, Substandard E. Describe the causes and the consequences of Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we're going to talk about these two things, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But we've got to look close at this now. So describe the causes and then describe the consequences. Two different things there. What caused these things to be passed by Congress as laws, and then what were the consequences of these two things as laws. So that's what we got to do. That's our obligation here. So we're going to look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the causes and the consequences, and then the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the causes and the consequences. And the themes here are civil rights, political, social interactions, these two acts made by Congress. So the two words here are causes and then consequences of both of these things here we have to talk about. So let's first talk about the causes of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Civil Rights Act insinuates that an act is a bill that becomes a law. So Congress made this, our legislature, the U.S. Congress made this act, Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what's going to cause the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Simply put, Southerners were unwilling to allow African Americans to have equal rights with whites. And we talked about this before. In what ways were Southerners willing to, or attempting to keep African Americans to exercise equal rights with whites? In other words, debase them to a second-class citizens. What did we do? What did Southerners do? And we talked about the election of 1876 back in Unit 4, the end of Reconstruction. And we talked about how the end of Reconstruction came with this compromise of 1877. They removed the troops from the South and ended Reconstruction with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. Reconstruction come to an end. Immediately after that, the rise of Jim Crow. Well, we talked about that was segregation laws, in which in the 1870s and 1880s, a lot of laws were passed that separated the races in society, what we call segregation or Jim Crow laws. And it's these laws here are the ways in which African Americans were not really treated equally with whites. So these separate facilities for blacks and whites were part of Jim Crow South segregation. And so these segregation laws that separated these public facilities, they were actually in the laws of these states that were called Jim Crow laws. And we saw that Plessy versus Ferguson made these laws expand all over the place because the Supreme Court says separate but equal. Separate facilities as long as you get an equal service water. Well, here's African American kid. We looked at these pictures before. We talked about how, in Georgia there was a law that says all persons licensed to conduct a restaurant shall serve either white people exclusively or colored people exclusively, and shall not sell to the two races within the same room or serve the two races anywhere in the same license. So these Jim Crow laws or segregation laws happen in hotels, dining rooms, anywhere in the public. And so we saw that even in schools, and in Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, Supreme Court is going to reverse this segregation of schools, and it's going to force the integration of schools or desegregation of schools. And we saw that Hutto High School was integrated with the white Bainbridge High School in 1970. And we saw that our hospitals served exclusively whites or exclusively blacks here in Bainbridge. And we talked about the Montgomery bus boycott, where the African Americans had to sit in the rear of the bus and give their seats up to white people. And so these laws are the causes why Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed it into law. Here he is signing into law. Here's Martin Luther King Jr. looking on as he signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We're going to talk about this in the next standard as well, what made this law be passed. And we have to talk about the consequences of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So we just talked about what caused the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What are the consequences? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 legally ended Jim Crow laws and segregation in the United States. It said that these Jim Crow laws are now illegal, outlawed, unconstitutional, and that any segregation in the United States is illegal. That's what the Civil Rights Act did. That's the consequence of the act. So we see here that a consequence is that segregation in public accommodations is going to be prohibited. So no longer can hotels or restaurants say they will not serve blacks and whites together exclusively. Now blacks and whites can stay in hotels and blacks and whites can stay in restaurants. They have to under this law. Also, employment, federal employment, and education, any type of employment and education, cannot discriminate on the basis of race. So you can't keep a job from someone in the United States just because they're black. And you can't keep them out of schools just because they're black. So blacks and whites both must have access to jobs in schools and hotels and public facilities and restaurants. And also the Civil Rights Act, one of the other consequences that the president has the power to enforce the law, use the military and the National Guard, or any other powers disposal to enforce this Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we see that there are four things actually that come through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Four consequences are that outlawed discrimination in public places like in hotels and restaurants. That's outlawed with this. So no longer can you keep blacks from sitting with whites in a restaurant or a hotel. The other one is it prohibits discrimination by the government in federal funding. If you give funding to whites, you have to give equal funding to blacks if they qualify for it. And then it prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And that's going to expand to covering elder people. You can't discriminate in hiring or retention in workforce just because someone's old or because of their race or their disability even, or if they're pregnant. We're going to see those things play out in U.S. history. And then it established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to make sure that in hiring, African Americans and other groups that are minorities are not discriminated against. And that's what the impact that's going to be of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And here recently in 2009, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually protected whites and white firefighters in New Haven, Connecticut. This is Frank Ricci, and these guys complained, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court that through the federal court system, that they had been unfairly treated and denied promotions because of their race, because they were white firefighters, and they won. The high court voted 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court of the United States. 5-4 decision saying that these white people have been discriminated against in their employment and promotions because they were white men. So we see that the consequences of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 affect everyone, not just African Americans. Alright, let's talk about the causes of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, because we've got to talk about the voting rights. Notice the emphasis on the word voting. Voting Rights Act. Voting rights. The right to vote for African Americans. And we know that African American men got the right to vote in the 15th Amendment during the Reconstruction. But here's the cause of the Voting Rights Act. Southerners, even after the 15th Amendment, were unwilling to allow African Americans to vote. And they resisted with attempts and these devices to keep African Americans from voting because they didn't want black men voting or anyone else voting that was African American. And we see this with the end of Reconstruction. There's going to be a change to these Jim Crow laws and the rise of the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. And they're going to use, the KKK is going to use intimidation and violence, even murder sometimes, to keep African Americans from voting. They're going to use whippings, lynchings, kidnapping, house burnings, burning crosses in yards to keep African Americans from voting and exercising that political right. And they're also going to devise things like poll taxes. You got to pay money before you can vote. Here we talked about that. And then a literacy test. If you can pass the test, then you can vote. Most African Americans were illiterate after the Civil War. A lot of them didn't have any money. Here's a little cartoon talking about a literacy test, and they can make these as hard as they wanted to in southern states. And then there was also the grandfather clause that said if your grandfather was a voter, you could too, prior to 1865. And then all these were mechanisms. There was a white primary to keep African Americans from voting. So these are the causes of the Voting Rights Act, not why we needed to have a Voting Rights Act passed by Congress or legislature. This this bill that becomes a law, is that Southerners resisted attempts for African Americans to vote, and that's what the cause was. Okay, and so in 1965, Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So those are the causes. Here he is signing this into law. What are the consequences of the Voting Rights Act of 1965? Simply put, the law suspended literacy tests or outlawed literacy tests and grandfather clauses in voter registration. You got rid of those two things and said, and this right here is going to result in a huge increase of African Americans registered and vote throughout the South. That's a consequence. Also, a lot of African Americans are going to run for office and be politicians during this time period. And the U.S. government in 1965 is going to send federal officials to register voters in the South. And this is going to result in an increased number of African American candidates being registered in the South. Alright, so here's a chart here showing the consequences. Here's 1960 before the Voting Rights Act, and this is 1966 after the Voting Rights Act. The number of African Americans that were registered to vote almost doubled, or actually did double, almost tripled in Alabama, from 22,000 to 175,000 voters registered in Mississippi. Not much change here in North Carolina, although some change. It's definitely an increase. And then we have South Carolina increasing, we have Tennessee increasing. I don't have Georgia's numbers, but we definitely see an increase in the number of African Americans registering the vote because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So in 1964, they asked for the 24th Amendment to ban that poll tax we talked about, because election laws are based on federalism is a power of the states. So they pushed forward this 24th Amendment in 1964 to ban the poll tax so all people can vote. And see, here we have these three things, and I think we've met our objective there. We've talked about what caused those acts to be needed to be passed and what the consequences are. So describe the causes and consequences, those two things, of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Both of these passed by Congress and signed by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. Good luck on the quiz, the test, and the EOCT.